all to this taster lecture, and hope that you enjoy it. And I hope that we also can welcome you all to UCL and IRDR if you're planning to enroll in September. And we will look forward to working with you and teaching you and having tea and coffee with you and all the things that we do during the normal academic year, or whatever we can do during a COVID type year. We'll do our very best to make it a good experience. So my theme today is to talk to you about some emerging strands in disaster risk reduction. In other words, looking at how things are going at present, and we are in an unprecedented time, of course, with COVID and the whole crisis, and how things might go in the future and what we might have to face in the future. So let me start by sharing my screen. And hopefully you can see some firemen on a cherry picker, a ladder thing here, putting out a fire, and the title, Some Emerging Themes in Disaster Risk Reduction. So let's get on with this and do some review of that. And then afterwards we can have some question and answer where you can put your views or ask questions, and we can have a bit of a debate. So we're looking firstly at threats and hazards. I suppose the word threat applies more to anthropogenic hazards, things like terrorism, cyber attack and all of that. Hazard applies more to natural hazards such as floods and storms and earthquakes and so on and so forth. We'll be dealing with common risks, and as you look at the Thames barrier here, it's been in operation since 1984. It protects central London against flooding. In the background there, you can see Canary Wharf and the City of London and the winding progress of the River Thames upstream. But just imagine the weight of water on that barrier there. When we get high tides and storm surges and high water levels and so on, the barrier really does protect, but it's part of a system of protection against flooding for vulnerable and sensitive locations in central London. Each of those metal barriers that swings up into the river there is able to withstand a pressure of 9,000 tons of water on it, and it probably needs to as well. So we'll be looking at some common risks and how they might pan out in the future, but also at some uncommon risks. So let's consider the riskscape, the risk landscape of different things that are both workaday, likely, probable, well-known, and much less so. Flooding, of course, is one of the archetypal forms of well-known and common types of hazard. Very common across the UK. We're looking at a northern UK example of it here. And in fact, if we take the United Kingdom as an example, it's definitely clear that flooding is going to increase with climate change, because we're going to get more extreme events, more extreme rainfalls and so on, and perhaps greater storm surges along the coast. At the same time, as the population of the country increases, there is more demand for space, particularly urban space, and therefore there is pressure to urbanize floodplains, and that will include some floodplains that are not adequately protected. A survey by the UK Environment Agency of flood defences around the country suggested that only a third of existing flood defences are fully compatible with modern standards, meaning that the others require more maintenance, they require improvement, and of course there are large tracts of land or riverbank or coast that require better flood defences, higher walls or greater levees or whatever. The result of increasing flood losses is that it is increasingly difficult to insure against floods in the UK. And that's not only in the UK, it's true in many other countries, New Zealand, Australia, United States, Canada, wherever you like. wherever insurance against floods is available or is potentially available. And floods lead to other problems, but to examine those, we can switch to the next slide. There's a sort of archetypal picture of an urban flood. And we've got potential problems for movement, transportation, railways underwater, roads underwater, potential problems with communication, the broadband antenna, the switching stations for telephones underwater, possible electricity outages because the substation and the transformers are underwater, supermarket underwater here, hospital underwater, power station underwater, water treatment works underwater, the whole lot underwater. And when you get floods of that kind, then you obviously have a whole distributed set of different problems to deal with. And that can be particularly complex, but more about that later on. Now let's look at a less common problem. And in fact, this is one example of a whole suite of problems of this kind, that many of which are in fact not well known at all, and neither in fact is this one. But there you see a nice red arrow, and it points to a spot in the confluence of the rivers Thames and Medway. The Thames snakes its way off towards the left-hand side of the picture and towards central London. The Medway snakes its way down into Kent, and both of those are shipping channels. But what have we got where the red arrow is? In fact, what we have got is a ship that sank in August 1944, and for more than 76 years has been there untouched. In fact, not quite untouched, because for the first month, mainly September 1944, a salvage operation was underway. But less than halfway through, it was stopped because it was too dangerous. And the SS Richard Montgomery was a munition ship, and it actually contains 14,346 unexploded bombs to a total of 1,434 tons of trinitrotoluene, TNT, explosive material. And what perhaps should worry us about this particularly is that it is extremely close to a major shipping lane where natural gas ships and container ships pass by a matter of a few hundred meters from the ship itself. There you see one of the ship's masts, because it's in very shallow water. And so a navigation error could in fact be quite fatal. And the explosion in the port of Beirut earlier in this year, in March this year, sorry, earlier than that, but anyway, the explosion in the port of Beirut was a wake-up call regarding the Richard Montgomery that sits here with this cargo of bombs as yet unsalvaged after 76 years. So if we in fact look at the situation regarding risk for the Montgomery, there's the shipwreck full of unexploded bombs. What we know about unexploded ordnance is that it doesn't get safer over time. So the idea that if you just leave all of this, it gets safer, in fact, is quite wrong. But we have deteriorating condition of the bombs themselves, of the ship itself. We have the possibility of a terrorist attack. We have the possibility that the ship might collapse because after 76 years in cold water, the steel is in poor condition. And we have the possibility of a collision. At the same time, we've got the shifting sands underneath the hull of the ship, which stress the wreck itself. And all of that begs the question of how well we might be likely to respond to an emergency caused by this problem. Now, so far, our master's students have completed 3 theses on the Richard Montgomery, looking at different aspects of the problem, the government decision-making process, the risks involved, the perception of the local population, and the evacuation plans for the local area. Very interesting too. They've actually had an impact in this. Questions have been asked in the Houses of Parliament on the basis of work by our students. A documentary film was recently made, and one of our students was the star of it. So in fact, we have been quite active there. But what about other unusual hazards? Well, the UK, like the United States, is one of only two countries, the US and the UK, that provide a daily space weather forecast. Now, space weather is the mass transport of plasma from the sun, where you get something like this, a coronal mass ejection, a solar flare, which sends a geomagnetic storm into the space, and it may in fact reach the Earth after between 15 and 24 hours, probably around 18 hours. And at that point, we start to get problems. Now, in 1859, a man called Richard Carrington, who was an amateur astronomer, had his telescope trained on the sun. Now, of course, he wasn't looking through it because you don't, but he had it also trained on a piece of card. And he was eating his breakfast, and to his amazement, he saw the biggest sunspots he'd ever imagined. And he drew a sketch of them on the piece of card, rushed off to get his wife to confirm this. By the time she arrived, they dissipated, but 18 hours later, the space weather event arrived at Earth. Now, the only technology at the time was the telegraph, but you could send a telegraph message without turning the telegraph on, such was the geomagnetic current. And people who did send telegraph messages got their fingers burnt. What this would mean with modern technology is that we might have damage to electricity transformers, not the small common or garden ones, but the ones about the size of a large room that take about a year to substitute if they burn out. We might have damage to various kinds of satellite, global navigation satellites and communication satellites, and some of that damage might be permanent. So communications interruptions and global positioning system interruptions are inevitable if we get another Carrington event. Well, clearly it hasn't happened since 1859, but we might like to reflect that in 2012, a Carrington event narrowly missed the Earth. In other words, we didn't have the alignment whereby it would hit us, but it very narrowly missed us. And we've had some lesser events. Indeed, one of them occurred whilst I was at a space weather conference. So it is indeed a significant risk. Now, of course, if we did have electricity interruptions, we really would have some problems. So let's look at an example, which is the case of the United Kingdom's national grid for the distribution, in fact, for the generation and distribution of electricity, and see what effect it is likely to have if it goes down. Now, what is the national grid? There's a map of it, and it consists of 23,500 kilometers of lines at 400 kilovolts or more. 249 power stations provide the energy. 179 of those are large, but only 9% of them are cold start ones. In other words, if we had to shut down, or if automatically the whole grid shut down, then we would be reliant on only 9% of power stations where somebody physically cranks the handle or whatever it takes to get the thing going again. That means that all the other power stations actually need an electricity supply in order to restart. So according to grid experts, what that means is that if we lost the lot in a domino-like collapse of the grid system, it would take us a minimum of 5 days to get it back and a maximum of 2 weeks. 2 weeks probably for the rural areas. It's worth noting that the process of restarting it will be very delicate because it's a question of balancing supply and demand. So if the government says, could you switch on this area because it's got 5 hospitals in it? The answer might well be no, we can't, because we'd have an excess of demand over supply and the whole thing would go backwards again and shut down. A point to bear in mind. And of course, the 5 to 14 days is dependent on no delays caused by the need to repair damage in any way. The point about electricity failure is that it really is the key to critical infrastructure. If you haven't got electricity, you haven't got water because you can't pump it. You can't use the toilets because you can't pump wastewater. Your air conditioning, your heating will be down. You won't have gas because that also relies on electricity. The problem with food is that much of it requires refrigeration, which is electrically driven. Now, hospitals will have their own generators, and by law, they're required to have 11 days worth of fuel. We have to hope that critical installations, from hospitals to police stations or whatever else, fire stations, have got their own generators, and these will work. But a survey of London critical infrastructure suggested that only 30% of generators would indeed work, and that's quite worrying for the rest. A simulation at New Scotland Yard, the police headquarters, in fact, took away the electricity and the generator failed to kick in because they had neglected to supply it with enough fuel. There will be no traffic control, traffic lights and so on, and no fuel pumping. No mass communications at all. Money supply and finance and so on are completely dependent on electricity. Electronic transactions govern everything. So all sorts of different problems would arise from the failure of electricity, assuming that that is more widespread and longer than a very short and circumscribed local outage. Let's look at another example of a complex sort of cascading event. The eruption of Eyjafjallajökull in Iceland took place in April and May 2010. And it left us over 70% of Europe's airspace with a shutdown of civil aviation for 6.5 days. That left approximately 8.5 million people stranded around Europe, and indeed outside Europe, trying to get back to Europe. Air transportation-based commerce was also very badly affected. But the sad thing we have to report there is that there is still no coordinated European emergency plan, which of course needs to be international, for substituting other forms of transportation in an orderly way if we lose air transportation. Now in 1822 and 1823, Eyjafjallajökull, which is one of the smaller Icelandic volcanoes, erupted for 13 months, of which 25 days were on full blast. So we have to imagine a scenario in which some Icelandic volcano erupts and fills the atmosphere across Europe with particulates, silica, suspended in the atmosphere, which is not good for jet engines or indeed other aspects of civil aircraft, the avionics, the skin, the windshield and all of that. So that could mean no civil aviation or stop-start civil aviation over a longish period. And that brings us to the whole concept of cascading disasters or cascading risks. Now, this really is something we need to get to grips with. We live in networked societies. And what that actually means is that when an impact occurs, it might be a storm, it might be a terrorist act, it might be an earthquake, it might be goodness knows what, flooding, anything, then very commonly the risks are distributed across networks or in chains in a variety of ways. For example, if we consider what happened in March this year, when a container ship, one of the new larger ones, and we have container ships capable of transporting up to 24,000 containers, as a result of high winds and possibly navigation errors, blocked the Suez Canal. Right, well, it took 5 days or more to get it off. And in that time, global commerce slowed down because a vast amount of shipping actually uses the Suez Canal, and it cannot afford the time spent waiting for problems like this to be solved. But problems like this are perfectly understandable and indeed predictable. It wasn't the first time that the Suez Canal has been blocked. It's simply that with the increasing size of container ships, then global commerce in many different ways is dependent on the arrival of goods according to timetable. And remember that what's in the containers there is a highly varied range of stock, some of which will be components, some of which will be finished products and so on, that will go into all sorts of economic activities. So, what do we mean by cascading disasters? Well, essentially a series of distributed and connected impacts, some of which are direct and some of which are indirect or secondary, upon a variety of different sectors. So we have the trigger impact. It might be an earthquake, it might be a flood, it might be a terrorist bomb or something like that. It might simply be a technological failure. But then we have the chain and the network of effects upon different sectors. An example of this is when Novichok, which is a chemical weapon, was deployed apparently by Russian spies in the city of Salisbury. And you might not be aware that one effect of that was that it depressed house prices and the real estate market in Salisbury by about 5% for a period of time, eventually recovered, but nevertheless it had a knock-on effect upon the housing market in this city. Not something one would immediately think of as a response to the use of chemical weapons. Now, I do believe that if we want to understand disasters, we need to look at two rather separate things. Or are they so separate? We will see. But firstly, fully to understand disaster, we've got to look at what starts it off. Now, in the case, for example, of a fire in a tower block, it might simply be the event that starts the fire. In Grenfell Tower in London, when 72 people died in a fire in a 24-story block, it was in fact a short circuit in a refrigerator that set off the fire. That was the triggering event. But the root causes were related to the flammability of the building and how vulnerabilities were constructed and how dynamic pressures on developers, on the overseers of safety, and the people who had to evaluate risk and so on, panned out over time. But I would say that we need to do more than that, which is why I propose a sort of egg model. The yolk of the egg, the yellow bit, is the set of factors, the suite of factors that causes disaster. But we also need to look at the context in which disaster occurs. And this occurred to me simply because I don't believe that you can really understand disaster if you don't understand the conditions under which it occurs. And a second factor there is you can't make people safe against disaster unless you can make them safe generally. For example, if you're trying to make people safe against floods, if they're not safe generally, then what's the point of being safe against floods? It really doesn't make much difference. So on that basis, we need to look at disaster according to how specific vulnerability to particular events, such as earthquakes or floods or terrorism or technological failure or whatever it is, occurs within the context of general vulnerability. So in that sense, we need to combine the analysis of the causes with the analysis of the consequences. And that's as simple as I can get it, because cascading consequences can occur at a whole variety of scales, from purely local to international. For example, in the case of the tower block fire in London in 2017, it was rather similar to events of that kind that occurred in Dubai, France, Australia, and Kazakhstan, hence the international cascading impacts of this. Moreover, more than 500 buildings were found around the United Kingdom that were at risk of a similar sort of fire, hence the national cascading effects. Now, in the UK, we have a national risk register. You can download it very easily. It's perfectly free to access. And it contains notes upon 36 major risks and about 94 risks in total. Every 2 years or so, but rather irregularly, it is updated, and the latest edition was published last year. Now, that's not a bad thing, and the UK was a pioneer in producing risk registers. Other countries have followed suit. Italy, the Netherlands, Ireland, and various others all have their own national risk registers. And it is a way of saying these are the risks the country faces. The problem, the criticism that I would level against the UK National Risk Register is firstly that it tends to treat risks singly. In other words, it doesn't look at the scenarios that are involved when risks combine with each other, and they do. Consider, for example, a coastal flood caused by storms. Well, the storms in their own right are a problem, a risk. The flooding is a problem. We might also have toxicity problems if, for example, the flood strips the top off a landfill. And those are just some of the possible distributed effects of coastal flooding. So it is really necessary to think in terms of scenarios, but more about that shortly. Another problem with the risk register is it's not widely known and it's not widely used. It does deserve to be more widely used. But a debate about it is underway, and perhaps that's a healthy thing. So really, the problem with the modern world that we live in is that when we're dealing with disaster risk, we are dealing with complexity, and our job is to make sense of the complexity. We've got risks that occur by sheer coincidence together. We've got risks that cascade into each other. We've got risks that connect with each other. For example, the risk of loss of electricity or basic infrastructure, and financial risks, and perhaps also terrorism-related risks. So, in point of fact, we've got a whole variety of different combinations of risk, and this is something that our greatest challenge is to make sense of that. For example, here's a simple example, relatively so. In January 2017, in a 90-minute period, 3 fairly violent earthquakes occurred in central Italy. Now, that caused an avalanche in an area that had had very high snowfall, and in fact, the snowfall had knocked out electricity to, at various times, between 30,000 and 50,000 people who were dependent on it in midwinter. But the earthquakes also caused an avalanche which killed 29 people in a hotel. They were waiting to be evacuated amidst heavy snowfall. And before that could happen, the avalanche destroyed the hotel. During the rescue operation, which was really a pretty heroic sort of event, a helicopter crashed with the loss of 6 lives. So connected events, they're not obviously connected, or not all of them are, perhaps the earthquakes and the avalanche, yes. But nevertheless, it does show how things can be coincident as well as connected. So we do indeed need to look at a sort of intersectionality of events. And a good way of visualizing that is the fact that during this long drawn out pandemic crisis that we're still living through, so far, there have been 3 major earthquakes. The first was in Croatia, the second was on the borders of Greece and Turkey, and the third was in Japan. And the picture shows damage in Izmir in Turkey. Now, generally speaking, direct response to things like earthquake involve very close proximity of people, no social distancing. But somehow we had to combine the measures to combat COVID-19 with the measures to respond to these earthquakes. And of course, there have been other unrelated disasters not related to the pandemic that have occurred all over the place, because in the world we have an average of about 2 disasters a day. Disasters are not exceptional events, emphatically not. 700 a year. So intersectionality, the pandemic and other disasters, no doubt the pandemic is a disaster, nearly 4 million dead, hardly surprising we could call it a disaster. Actually, if we look purely at the pandemic, we can start to see some of the immense complexity of it. How to deal with an emergent virus about which we know, well, we know a certain amount, but not enough by any means. And we have to learn as we go. How infectious is it? How likely is it to produce more than one wave? Very likely, as it happens this time. How likely is it to mutate? Now, these are things that actually we've been debating for quite a long time. We had the basic scenario for a viral pandemic after the last SARS episode, which stretched from 2002 to 2004. The period 2003 to 2009 was one of intense scenario generation. So in fact, we knew what was going to happen in 2020 to 21. We knew about much of this, even if we didn't know the basic full details. But nevertheless, when we have to deal with it, we have to deal with finding the disease, treating people, isolating those that are at risk, protecting them, and all that in the midst of balancing other things, communication, leading to trust or loss of trust in authority, the need to curtail activities and distance people, which might mean that many things don't happen. International travel, the hospitality business, the entertainment business, events of various kinds that involve mass gathering, restrictions on movement and on association, the need to promote forms of hygiene, compliance and policing. It is sobering to think that 88 countries during COVID have curtailed human rights. Many of them have used the COVID emergency as an opportunity to curtail human rights. But anyway, whether or not that happens, we're dealing with the need to make integrated decisions in a whole variety of different sectors. We need to communicate well, we need to decide well, we need to cure people, we need to treat them well, we need to research the virus well, we need to have the right measures epidemiologically, and to make predictions and so on, none of which, of course, is in any way easy. For example, in producing a vaccine, which is something that clearly will only happen 6 to 9 months after the start of the crisis, when we exactly know what the virus is, and when we've started to develop a means of combating it, there are a lot of different things that need to be dealt with, as you can see in this sort of shopping list type diagram. But there are at least 7 areas in which things could go drastically wrong with the production, distribution, administration of a vaccine. The production plant in the wrong place, problems with the production itself, quality control problems, distribution problems, priority problems, all sorts of things can occur. And vaccine manufacture is not like manufacturing broom handles or any regular commodity. It's a very delicate, difficult process. Now, one point about cascades and so on is that there's a whole variety of different effects that they will have. For example, going back to the eruption of Eyjafjallajökull, it affected the whole variety of sectors. You wouldn't expect the cut rose industry, in other words, the flower supply industry, to be affected, but 90% of Europe's roses are grown in Kenya, and they are brought to Europe by air freight. Symphony orchestras depend upon touring for some of their revenue. Bone marrow transplants didn't occur during the eruption because the donors were in North America and the bone marrow didn't arrive by air freight in Europe. And so it goes on. And these are just some of the distributed effects. One thing, of course, we haven't dealt with is the digital scene, but that is most important, the cyber scene. Now, there are all sorts of things. Generally speaking, cyber terrorism is moving away from interruption of activities, although we still have some spectacular examples of that, towards influence instead of sabotage, as we see with attempts to influence elections. Now, there is a strong question of the difference between reality and what people perceive to be reality. So one of the issues, one of the problems with this is that the cyber world is giving us a distinction between perceived reality, objective reality, and the newly emergent manufactured reality, where social media and so on can create something that appears to be real, but perhaps isn't. And that then can be manipulated by unscrupulous people or organizations or governments. So we're in a reality in which there are some really difficult and delicate and challenging problems associated with the cybersphere. And at the worst, we might be facing a situation of nihilism, where in fact there is a catastrophic loss of trust in leadership and government. And that is something that in the management of crises and emergencies, we have to be very careful to do all we can to avoid. So we need to be a bit more positive, and let's look at what actually we need in order to manage situations adequately, crises. Now, one thing to bear in mind here is that a great deal more money is sunk in things that cause the crisis, the emergency, the disaster, than in things that remediate it, that put it right again. Indeed, some have argued that the cure to damage ratio is 1 to 43, meaning that 43 times as much money is actually spent on making things worse than on making it better. The only crumb of comfort we can derive from that is that regarding fossil fuels, about 1,000 times as much is invested in promoting and producing fossil fuels than is invested in the alternatives to fossil fuels and getting global warming down. I trust that that is going to change over time. What we can do, though, for a start, is we can use scenarios. We can develop reasonable working scenarios on the basis of systems analysis, whereby we can look not merely at the hazard, the risk, the impact, but we can look hypothetically at the consequences and the response. So we need scenarios not merely of what happens, but what we're going to do about it, what we're capable of launching in the way of a relief effort, recovery, reconstruction, and above all, mitigation. So the basis of this, and COVID has really underlined this, is that each country needs a proper, decent, functional civil protection system. It has to be coordinated nationally, it has to be harmonized regionally, but the theatre of operations in any disaster, whether it's global, local, national, regional, it doesn't matter. The theatre of operations is always local. So if we haven't got the local capacity, we're not going to manage things. Therefore, we need to ensure that the local response capacity is there, it's fully functional, it's backed up by national, if not international resources, and that will act in favor of the safety and the recovery and the protection of local residents everywhere. We also need all of this to be sustainable. So we need to think very deeply, very carefully about what sustainable disaster risk reduction consists of. One thing to bear in mind is that it requires the full support of the population. People have got to realize that we need this. We need to put money into it and resources. We need to participate in it. It needs to be democratic and participatory. In addition to that, it also needs to connect up with the general sustainability agenda. Disaster risk reduction, therefore, is one element in providing sustainability for the future generations who will follow us on this planet. Time for a conclusion or two. We need realism and we need flexibility. We need to understand the world as it is and where it's going in a time when climate change may drastically intensify some of the challenges that we, as specialists in disaster risk reduction, have to deal with. We need adaptable management. We need flexibility in the way we do deal with it. We need creativity above all else. Creativity, your creativity. And in so doing, we need to recognize that we must create a lateral discipline, something horizontal. You don't need to be a political scientist or an economist or a geologist, but you need to be able to have a dialogue with these people about 42 different disciplines and professions. So we need this really strong horizontal discipline of disaster studies in favor of better mitigation of future disasters, greater safety for our populations. And that essentially is what we need amidst a whole variety of challenges, from demographic change. When I was born, the population of the world was 2.6 billion, and in my lifetime, it's tripled so far. We need to ensure that we can combat forms of extremism and that we can successfully, collectively, democratically get to grips with disaster by understanding its full range of conditions and impacts. And if we don't, we'll end up, as the old saying goes, merely rearranging the deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic as it sails towards the iceberg. Rather surprisingly and rather bizarrely, I found an actual picture of the deck chairs on the Titanic. Would you believe it? Anyway, that's the end of this, and thank you for listening. If you're interested in what we could do for emergency planning regarding pandemics, last year I produced a report. It probably needs some updating now, and sooner or later I'll get round to that. But you can download it from our Institute's website, and it's quite a long and complex, detailed sort of document, and that's my contribution to this particular topic. Thanks very much for listening. If you have any questions, then I'll be very happy to answer them as best I can.